There's been another murder, hasn't there? Nobody told me. Nobody had to. I always know everything.
ご機嫌いかがですか？渡辺Danです。On today's episode of Alt Cinema, we're going to be looking at 1946's The Spiral Staircase. The Spiral Staircase sits at a very unusual period in Hollywood history. First of all, the war was over, so Hollywood actually had one of its best years ever. But this was also to be one of the last years before a bunch of disasters would start hitting the entertainment industry. The first of those disasters would, of course, be the beginning of television. Now, it was very nascent at this point, it was still in the experimental stage, but within 3 years, it would be a major threat. In addition to television, there was also a very challenging ruling that was about to come down called the Paramount Decision. Now, in film school, we're often taught that the Paramount decision forced the studios to get rid of their theaters. It was actually a much worse decision because it forced the theaters to drop the studios, meaning the studios lost their source of financing. Much, much worse if you think about it. Further, with a lot of the soldiers returning from the war, there was a sense of disease or of unease. For one thing, even though Nazism and Japan imperialism had been defeated, it looked as if a lot of the problems were still there. This would come to the fore in 1946's Best Picture, The Best Years of Our Lives, which looked at the plight of returning soldiers. Also coming up at the same point was a bit of suspicion towards women. Now, during the war, you had women depicted as being nothing but really, really strong figures. But with men coming back and women having had a sense of liberation by being in the workforce, you had a lot of women who weren't necessarily so willing to go back into the kitchen and be a mama helper. So there was a lot of tension there, and that began to express itself in the form of film noir, which was a very dark look at the world as opposed to the happy brightness of the musicals of, let's say, the 40s and the war era, or the optimism of the Depression era movies. The film noir films would add a whole new stylistic that was based a lot in Citizen Kane and deep focus photography and a whole host of other stylistic issues. One of the great innovators of the film noir movement was Robert Siodmak, who had escaped from Germany at the very tail end of Weimar and the very, very beginning of Nazism, knew when the getting was good. He and his brother moved to Hollywood. His brother would write things like The Wolfman. Robert Siodmak, on the other hand, would end up becoming the more famous of the two with some of his most impressive film noir, such as The Killers. The Spiral Staircase is a movie that sits in the middle of a lot of these changing social waves. And although advertised as a suspense thriller, it was actually a lot more than that. In fact, for a movie that is relatively minor, that doesn't really have A-level stars, it has turned out to have an incredibly long pedigree. It inspired a lot of TV movies. It inspired the entire giallo subgenre of body count movies that would become all the rage in the 60s and 70s. It set the tone for the psychological thrillers that would come in the 60s and 70s. So this is a movie that, although it seems very, very simple on the surface, has a lot that's worth examining. Helen is played by Dorothy McGuire, and Dorothy McGuire came from the world of the stage. And she was one of these ingenues who seemed to not have a lot of personality. She seemed to be rather bland until, usually in the middle of the movie, she would be challenged. And in that challenge, she would show a fierceness that belied her looks. And she will use that to good effect here too. I mean, look at the character. We have a girl who cannot speak. I mean, can we talk about someone who is more disenfranchised? And yet, when she's left alone, when she has to figure out what she's going to do, does she act like some victim? No. She puts herself forward and does everything to make sure she survives. Now, she makes a couple of wrong decisions in the process, but she remains self-reliant in a way that we would see come into firmer grasp as the 40s turned into the 50s, and as film noir kind of smoothed itself out, and the fear of a working woman, partially because of the TV show I Love Lucy, became less severe. The story concerns Helen, who lost her parents in a fire. That fire caused her to have a lot of trauma, so she no longer has a voice. She is now a companion to an old crippled woman who lives in a huge mansion. This old crippled woman is played by Ethel Barrymore in one of her greatest Gorgon performances. She is Mrs. Warren. Mrs. Warren was a very iconographic woman when she was younger. You would think that she was probably she probably would have been a suffragette if this was a little bit later in time period and she had been a little bit younger. But she certainly was an unusual woman for her time. She had trapped her husband by her very masculinity, by the fact that she could shoot better than he could, and that she had that innate toughness. And she took over the raising of one of their her husband's sons and raised another. And unfortunately, both of these sons turned out to be weak.
The only kind of beauty he had any respect for was strength. And he had two sons, both weaklings. They hated guns and hunting. He used to run away from them, Dr. Parry. Well...
And we all know that weak is a nice little production code thing for gay, because they were always known for being very quick to cry, not being very masculine, not liking to play with guns or anything like that. And so the father had obviously been disappointed. Into this realm comes a series of murders. And the movie opens with Helen going to see a silent movie, which is actually quite overwrought, and yet you can tell she really enjoys it. While the silent movie is running, upstairs, a lame girl who apparently has something wrong with her hip is murdered by a mysterious figure who had been hiding in her closet. Now, the eye of this mysterious figure, which unfortunately seems to give away who the culprit is actually Robert Siodmak's eye. So we see that Dario Argento, when he was doing Deep Red, would prefigure that and would use that same element, since he would often play the killers in his films, even if the ultimate killer would be revealed to be one of the other people. As Helen returns home from the theater where the murder had happened, she meets a doctor who is an outsider, very much like she is. He is not liked by the town because he is competition to the town's old doctor, someone who refuses to give him any help and who is very selfish about his own clientele. So we see that this idyllic town and this flashback structure to the late 19th century is not at all Meet Me in St. Louis. This is not a happy township. This is one that has a lot of uncomfortable things going on in it. Anyway, the Ken Smith character offers to drive her home. And in the process, he talks about a potential therapy that she could get to maybe help her get her voice back. Now, although this is played by Kent Smith, who is a dull actor, was able to use his dullness in a very, very intriguing way. And what that was that he was so boring that he could play absolute son-of-a-bitch characters and get away with it. Look at him in Cat People. In that movie, his wife is Simone, Eastern European who has a secret, mainly she turns into a leopard. And while he seems to be in love with her, while he seems solicitous, what does he do? Almost as soon as they're married, he gives in to the evil temptations of his co-worker, a female siren who chooses the moment after he gets married to let him know that she's in love with him, and he gives in to that temptation. I mean, we don't see them being actually adulterous, but we know. we know in a 1940s production code sort of way that they probably had a little bit of a flingette. He does the same thing here, because as much as he is solicitous toward Helen, there is the sense that he looks at her as someone who has no choice but to go with him. And that in and of itself is creepy. Why is it that he's interested in this girl who is crippled, not on some, or who can't speak, as opposed to someone who is maybe more appropriate for him, or maybe someone who could help him achieve a better position in the town if he was going to be that type of person? It is at this point that we meet some of the other characters in the house. One of them is the cook, played by Elsa Lanchester.
I'm never more witty than when I've had a little nip. I see better, I hear better, and I feel much better.
Now, Elsa Lanchester is always willing to be a little bit broad. And in the process of being a little bit broad, she has such firmness in her performing style that we enjoy her. And we enjoy the fact that she can do things like try to snatch a bottle when she's brought down into the basement with the boss of the house. Robert Siodmak and the writers are very good about not making her just a funny character. They bring out the fact that her humor comes at a cost. When the going gets rough, she is now passed out because the alcohol that she had been able to steal has actually been drugged. So now she is of no help. And that's a key point, that it shows that someone can be lovable, but that very lovability can be a liability. We also meet Rhonda Fleming, who plays the house secretary. And she finds herself in an uncomfortable position because both of the stepbrothers have feelings for her. Okay, whatever. But they don't like each other, so she becomes a battleground. And we get the sense that she is uncomfortable by this, but that she is economically trapped. She doesn't have anywhere to go. She's played by Rhonda Fleming, who was another Selznick discovery and who was known for her fieriness, her ability to be a second-rate Rita Hayworth, but still be someone who was always enjoyable to watch. In this one, even though she looks strong, she is actually weaker than the other characters. She is more willing to run than to stick it out when the going gets rough. And because of that, she's going to end up being another victim.
Oh, it's you. You scared the life out of me.
Let's look at the two guys who play the two brothers. One of them is played by George Brent, who is known primarily as Betty Davis's stooge. He was in 11 movies with her, and he always played the good-looking guy who was ultimately quite insubstantial, but served well between Betty and Miriam Hopkins or whoever else they were paired with. The weird thing about George Brent is that in real life, he seemed to have a lot more going for him than what he would show on the screen. Like Lana Turner, his screen performances were often very cold, but in real life, he had a lot of sexual adventures, and he slept around, and he was known as quite the ladies' man. So, sometimes what you see is not necessarily what you get. The other brother is played by Stephen Oliver. Now, Stephen Oliver had been in a couple of the Val Lewton movies, and he's someone who's a conventionally good-looking actor, and Siodmak plays opposite that by having him be a cad. He's someone who, I'm still going to say that he's sexually unavailable, but we notice that in a scene where he's talking to Rhonda Fleming, that he sits on the bed, almost tantalizing her, almost as if saying, I know you want to sleep with me, but you're not going to be able to. It's a very weird performance, and he's considered to be the one who is most likely to be the villain. Now, any of us who have seen one or two movies of the week on Lifetime know that someone who is so obviously being positioned as the killer must indeed be innocent. And sure enough, because he's a weak guy, he's going to end up being trapped by Helen and locked into a closet right at the moment when she actually needs him. Because the killer, and I'm going to spoil it here, but who cares, the movie is 70 years old, is George Brent.
And there's no room in the whole world for imperfection. The only person who could have prevented you from achieving the quiet that I can give you was Stephen. And you locked him up downstairs. We're quiet now, Helen. I'm glad I waited. Everyone's out of the way. Mrs. Oates is drunk. Because I purposely let her steal a bottle of brandy. And Oates is going to look for ether. Because I made sure there was no ether. And Blanche, whom I loved, didn't love me. So she had to die. She's dead, and at peace. And Stephen, you took care of him for me. Stephen is weak, as I once was. What a pity my father didn't live to see me become strong.
And again, George Brent was not someone that anyone in the audience would expect to be the killer. And the fact that he wears the leather gloves, which would become so iconographic in the giallo pictures, makes him even more sinister, that we sense that there's a sexual side to his killings. And he has his great line about how he wishes his father could see that he has become strong. He is ultimately defeated by his mother, played by Ethel Barrymore. And when she shoots him, we see that she has gotten out of bed. She has shown her true power as a mother figure. But the movie also leaves a very interesting moral quandary. She had thought it was her birth son who had been doing the murders, because they would always happen when he came back into town. So she seems relieved that it's actually her husband's first son. Does that make it any better? Does that mean that if it had been Stephen, that she would have been cool with it? That she would have been cool with letting him continue to do murders simply because of blood? So you see, the movie deals with all sorts of issues that we don't expect to see in a run-of-the-mill blood and thunder horror movie. And at the end, Helen, frightened by the chaos around her, lets out a scream. She has found her voice. And in a moment of extreme competence, she's able to talk on the phone and get Kent Smith to come back.
1, 8, 9. Dr. Perry, come. It's I, Helen.
So, as minor as this movie appears to be, it is one that has such a long tail and has influenced so many others that, in spite of some creakiness, which anything that's 70 years old would have, it's well worth revisiting just to see where a lot of this stuff all began.